Good evening, everyone. I'm Nicole Ozer. I'm the Technology and Civil Liberties Director at the ACLU in California. Since 2004, I have led the organization's cutting-edge work in California, working in the courts, with companies, with policymakers, and in communities to defend and promote civil rights in the digital age. Our team has worked to create landmark digital privacy laws like CalECPA. We've developed surveillance ordinances passed in Santa Clara County and Oakland and in communities across the country. We've worked with partners like the Center for Media Justice and Color of Change to expose and stop social media surveillance of Black activists on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And most recently, we have started a national campaign to bring attention to the very real threats of face surveillance. So tonight, we are talking face surveillance, and of course, I can't think of a more timely topic. For some quick background, the ACLU has long opposed face surveillance. We've identified it as a uniquely dangerous surveillance form and a particularly grave threat because of what it can do to secretly track who we are, where we go, what we do, and who we know, and how it can be built so easily layered on to existing surveillance technology, and how both data incentives and societal incentives really combine to make it ever more dangerous once it gets a foothold. And also how it feeds off and exacerbates a history of bias and discrimination in this country. Professors Woody Hartzog and Evan Selinger recently wrote, "Imagine a technology that is potently, uniquely dangerous. Something so inherently toxic that it deserves to be rejected, banned, and stigmatized. It is facial recognition. And consent rules, procedural requirements, and boilerplate contracts are no match for that kind of formidable infrastructure and irresistible incentives for exploitation." This past winter, our ACLU team in California discovered that the future is now. That face surveillance that had been thought of as a future technology was now being quietly but actively deployed by Amazon for local law enforcement. Amazon's recognition product promised locating up to 100 faces in a picture, real-time surveillance across millions of faces, and the company was marketing its use to monitor crowds and people of interest, and wanting to turn officer-worn body cameras into real-time roving surveillance. When we discovered the use of this technology, we were shocked to find that nothing was in place to stop it from being used as a tool to attack community members, to target protesters, or to be used by ICE, which we already know has been staking out courthouses, schools, and walking down the aisles of buses to arrest and deport community members. A coalition of 70 organizations came together this past spring, civil rights organizations, racial justice organizations, immigrants' rights organizations, to blow the whistle and to start pushing Amazons to stop providing face surveillance to the government. Our coalition call was quickly echoed by institutional shareholders, 150,000 members of the public, some of you, maybe some of them, hundreds of academics, and so far more than 400 Amazon employees themselves. The ACLU also reinforced the public understanding of the dangers of face surveillance by doing our own test of Amazon recognition. We use the default matching score that Amazon sets inside its own product and that we know that law enforcement has also used. The result? Amazon recognition falsely matched 28 members of Congress and disproportionately falsely matched members of color, including civil rights leader John Lewis. The Congressional Black Caucus and numerous others have expressed deep concern and have been asking Amazon for answers they largely have not gotten. The reality is that we only know the tip of the iceberg, how the government, particularly in the current political and social climate, is gearing up to try to use face surveillance to target communities. And we don't know what companies, both large and small, are doing and specifically not doing to protect community members. So that brings us to tonight's very timely discussion. First of all, I want to thank AI Now. ACLU is a founding partner of AI Now, and their research is helping to further inform some of this very important work. And I also want to thank them for the immense privilege of being here tonight to discuss this critical issue with Timnit, Gebru, and Sherrilyn Ifill. Timnit is a research scientist at Google AI. She studies the ethical consideration underlying data mining and what methods are available to audit and try to mitigate bias. She's also a co-founder of Black in AI, where she's working to increase important diversity in the field and reduce the negative impacts of bias in training data. Timnit's PhD is from Stanford, and she studied computer vision in the AI lab under Fei Li. We also have Sherrilyn Ifill, the president and director counsel on the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Sherrilyn is only the 7th in history to lead our nation's premier civil rights legal organization. For many in this audience, Sherrilyn needs no introduction. So many of us know and admire her as an acclaimed legal thinker, author, and true powerhouse in bringing to light and challenging issues of race in American law and society. So we are in for a wonderful conversation tonight to help us all dig deeply into understanding the broader social context of face surveillance, exploring how it is not about solving a technical matter, but how decisions about the future of the technology and how it is used and not used matters so profoundly to the future of who we are as communities and as a country. And to focus on what power we have, can continue to build, and will need to wield to push back aggressively on threats to the safety and rights of communities. So with that, let's get started. I have the first question for Sherrilyn. So face surveillance is a relatively new technology, but it isn't being developed in a vacuum. How do you think the threats of face surveillance fit within our country's history and practices of bias and discrimination?
Thank you so much, and I want to also thank AI Now for inviting me and for just convening this extraordinary evening, and for recognizing the importance of us getting our hands around this critical issue. And I really thank you, Nicole, for teeing up the first question in this way, because I think much of our conversation about technology in this country happens as though technology and AI in particular is developing in some universe that is separate than the universe you and I all know we live in, which is rife with problems of inequality and discrimination. So here we are, it's 2018, it's 4 years after we all watched Eric Garner choked to death by the NYPD. It's 4 years after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. It's 3 years after Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore. It's 3 years after Walter Scott was shot in the back in a park in North Charleston. It comes at a time of mass incarceration, a phrase that now everyone knows. When the United States incarcerates the most people in the world, the overwhelming percentage of them African American and Latino. It comes at a time in which we are segregated in this country at levels that rival the 1950s in our schools, where we live. It comes at a time of widening and some of the widest income inequality that we've seen in this country since the 1920s. And into that reality, we drop this awesome power that allows us to speed up all of the things that we currently do, take shortcuts, and theoretically produce efficiencies in doing what we do. So if we think about facial recognition technology just in the context that we most often talk about it as a threat in the context of law enforcement and surveillance, I mean, who here thinks the biggest problem of law enforcement is, that they need facial recognition technology? Why, as a matter of first principles, do we even think this is something that is needed for law enforcement? Why is this something that we would devote our attention to? Why would we devote our public dollars to the purchase of this technology when we recognize all of the problems that exist within law enforcement? And so what we do is we deposit these technologies into industries, into practices, into aspects of our society, into governmental institutions that already have demonstrated that they are unable to address deep problems of discrimination and inequality that leads to literally destroyed lives, not just the killing of people, which is bad enough, but actual destroyed lives. We drop it into a period of racial profiling. We drop it into stop and frisk. We were part of the team that sued the NYPD for stop and frisk, here in New York, and are diligently monitoring that consent decree. And we have a president calling us back to stop and frisk. And now we have a technology that purports to assist police in doing this kind of law enforcement activity. When we combine it with things like the gang database in New York, which we've been trying to get information about. New York City has a gang database. There were about 34,000 people in that gang database. They have reviewed it and dropped some folks out, so I think it's down to about somewhere between 17 and 20,000. So they obviously made mistakes since they were able to drop out 10,000 people. The gang database is somewhere between 95 and 99% African American, Latino, and Asian American. So it's 1% white. And we have asked the NYPD to tell us the algorithm, if you will, the technique by which they put somebody in the gang database and the process for getting out of it. Like if I discovered I was in the gang database, how could I get out of the gang database? And they still haven't provided us with that information, and we just filed suit last week for their failure to comply with our FOIA request. So now try to imagine marrying facial recognition technology to the development of a database that theoretically presumes that you're in a gang and that your name pops up in this database. And we know we're in the age of the internet, that even when you scrub me out of the database, it exists still somewhere. We are unleashing a technology that has the ability to completely transform forever the lives of individuals. We do work around employers and misusing criminal background checks. And some of the work demonstrates that your arrest record stays with you forever. And you have employers who will not employ anyone who has, an arrest on their record. We're talking about creating a class of unemployable people, a class of people who are branded with a kind of criminal tag. We have a number of school districts that have already invested in facial recognition technology, theoretically for the purpose of identifying students who are suspended, students who might be a danger, students carrying one of the 10 most popular guns used in school shootings when they come in the door. But very often these are not students who are suspended. And so now we're going to brand students within the school in certain kinds of ways as well. So the context in which this technology is coming to us, it to me is a very chilling context. And yet we talk about facial recognition technology and all of the other efficiency algorithms and AI technologies as though they exist, were created, or could be evaluated separately from this very serious context I just described.
And in terms of the historical context as well, when I think about history and face surveillance, I often think of the 1958 Supreme Court case, NAACP versus Alabama, where the NAACP was able to maintain the privacy of its membership list really in the heart of the civil rights movement. And in that case, the Supreme Court really recognized the vital relationship between privacy and the ability to exercise First Amendment rights to be able to speak up and to protest. So, in the current political context that we're in, how afraid are you, how worried should we be about the impact of face surveillance on civil rights and activist movements more generally?
We should be deeply worried. We should, when we hear the way this president or this attorney general talks about certain protesting groups, the creation of this category of Black identity extremists, the idea that this technology can be mounted and used, on police cameras, and that the police can be taking this kind of data from crowds of people who are coming out to exercise their First Amendment rights. We heard the way the crowds of people who came out to protest against the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh were characterized by the president and by some of the Republican leadership as a mob. And imagining that those kinds of protesters and activists would be subjected to facial recognition technology in which they would be presumably included in some kind of database that would identify them with these kinds of words. To think about what this means for young people who, we're in a movement period in this country in which young people are engaged and active and coming out and protesting. And now we want to monitor them. The recognition of NAACP versus Alabama, and the reason that the NAACP did not have to give up their membership list was because the court recognized the the possibility that that the revelation of who these individuals were would subject them to retaliation within their local community and would chill their ability, willingness, freedom to fully exercise their First Amendment rights. And I think facial recognition technology has the same threat to activist groups and to others who want to be out in the public space. And at some point, maybe we'll get to talk about that. So much of this is about implicating the public space and the contested public space in this country, and the way in which we now want to privatize everyone because you have to believe that if you step into the public space, you are automatically surveilled. And the last thing I'll say is, just to go back to the point about us being so segregated, the idea of facial recognition technology is not just recognizing a face, it's also evaluating that face and evaluating who they think you are. We already know, for example, that police officers tend to assign 5 additional years to African American boys, that they see African American boys as being much older than they already are. Who says that people who have grown up so segregated actually are in a position to evaluate faces, are actually in a position to tell people apart, are actually in a position to know whether someone is a threat or is dangerous? So once we go down this road, without recognizing the way in which, frankly, in America, many people who would be using this technology are uniquely ill-equipped to evaluate the face of someone, to recognize and to differentiate between 2 Black people or 2 Latino people. And for any woman who's been asked, why aren't you happy, why don't you smile more, knows that the idea that somebody can just look at you and tell what your emotion is, what you're feeling, what your intention is simply not true. And so we should recognize that it's not just that, it's gonna click and say, oh, that's Sherrilyn Ifill. It's gonna say more than that. It's going to try and evaluate, what my intentions are in that moment.
So for Timnit, I mean, maybe we're out protesting. I think that many of us can sort of understand a baseline that face surveillance is different because while you ostensibly can leave your cell phone at home and not be tracked, we can't leave our face at home. But on a more complex level, what do you think it is about face recognition that potentially makes it different, more dangerous, or risky than other AI technologies?
Well, I think actually you touched on many of the things I wanted to say. So the first thing is the fact that, for example, you said that it doesn't just recognize you, it evaluates you. And let's think about your emotions. Your emotions are, Rana, who started Affectiva, which is an emotion recognition company, your emotions are some of the most private things that you possess. And so even if it worked perfectly, that would be terrible if you can just walk around and people could now see your emotions. But the fact that it also doesn't work perfectly, but people have what we call automation bias, where they trust algorithms to be perfect, that combination is also bad, right? Because I might be perfectly happy and somebody could say I'm dissatisfied or something like that. I just read recently, so every day I learn something new about where this different automated facial analysis tools are being used. And I forgot the name of the company, that this company was using face recognition, automated facial analysis instead of these time cards. So then they were talking about the potential to then do emotion recognition in aggregate. Then if their employees are not satisfied, they can tell over time, and this is pretty scary, right? So a combination of things. The fact that there are some things that are very private to us that we just want to keep private. Even my research with Joy Bolamini showed that automated facial analysis tools have high error disparities for different groups of people, but at the same time, people also trust them to be perfect.
Yes.
So I think these 3 combinations are pretty dangerous.
And so speaking of some of sort of that research, there's been a lot of talk about accuracy or inaccuracy and sort of improving its function overall. How does some of this conversation really sort of miss some of the bigger picture around face surveillance?
So I think that the fact that we showed high error disparities could start the conversation, right? It's just the same way that the ACLU could show that there were high error rates for some of our members of Congress, right? But that doesn't mean that you should also have perfect face recognition that is being used against mostly Black and brown people, like you said. So these two conversations have to happen in tandem. So for example, for emotion recognition, again, I'll bring up Rana because she's the only person I've talked to about this. She talks about how she started Affectiva to help autistic kids, people with autism. And I've also talked to people who want to work with older people who have dementia and use some of this emotion recognition kind of technology. Now, this could be something good, right? And so in this particular case, you don't want high error rates, you don't want disparity, so this conversation about accuracy should happen. Similarly, there are some other computer vision technologies that are being used for melanoma detection or other kinds of things where, again, you don't want, a skin tone that's very dark to be for the AI technology not to work on it and get misdiagnosed. So that's one. So this conversation about accuracy should happen. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that the solution is to just have perfect accuracy face recognition, face surveillance being used everywhere, right?
And you sort of alluded to some of the sort of corporate space. The Face Surveillance Coalition has drawn particular attention to government use, I think, for some good reason. But I just wanted to explore with you all sort of can a distinction really be drawn effectively between sort of government use and corporate use, or do some of the issues really bleed and blend together in terms of civil rights and civil liberties? And in particular, this has been on my mind this week. Some of you all may have seen some of the press about that Facebook revealed this week that it thinks that some of its photos have been scraped by Russian face surveillance firms. This was an issue that we were particularly concerned about at the ACLU when the Cambridge Analytica story broke, because we know that at around the same time that Facebook provided data for third-party apps, they also started to change their privacy settings and got rid of privacy settings for things like photos. So we've been sort of very attentive to the issue that a lot of sort of those public photos and other types of information could really become a really great space for potentially scraping for face surveillance data. So, what do you all think can and should we be addressing sort of government and corporate issues separately, or do they necessarily bleed together and blend together, and should we be sort of looking bigger picture at some of these issues?
Well, I think on the privacy front, they actually blend together. This is part of the difficulty of this work, is that the pathway in is usually one or the other, right? So the pathway in is usually, this is a business, I'm running Amazon, or I'm running Facebook, and it's wonderful, and the owners and the shareholders are making lots of money, and people are using the technology for whatever reason they want to use it, and they're making a personal decision to use that technology, and so that's supposed to cover a multitude of ills, and it's not the government. But we know that the relationship between corporations and the government is often very close. And it gets very close, particularly in times of national security high alert, like post 9/11, right? Where you have, the telephone companies handing over data to the federal government for surveillance and so forth. So we know that there's always this kind of symbiotic relationship between the government and between corporations, and the government relies on corporations to develop technology for the government to use for a variety of reasons. So I don't think that there's some place where it's benign and some place where it's evil. I think the technology itself is like a monster that once unleashed is very hard to put back in the box. The problem, I think, is that where government stops acting like government and starts acting like it's just another corporation or another client of a corporation. The government's responsibility is to protect the public. And that's why this conversation about regulation is so important, because that's the government's role. And so it can't act just like another consumer of a product or client of a corporation. It is supposed to hold the public trust. And I think what we're seeing is the government fall down on that job, being so scared, being so tentative, buying this story, that, we have to leave these folks alone because they're the brilliant ones who are doing all this wonderful technological stuff, and if we regulate them, we're gonna smash their creativity. But I'm old enough to remember when we thought it was crazy that the government would require us to put a seatbelt across our waist. We thought it was just awful. And we didn't want to do it, and I come from a very big family, and so my seat in the back of our Buick was on the floor, like we sat kids on the floor. That was
I wrote a paper that links
really?
that. Yes.
It's
I'm
true,
glad you
and
brought
it
it up.
seemed insane at the time, right?
Yeah.
In the big car, you used to be able to sit you could fit as many people in your family as you could fit in the car. And my father was outraged when we had to put seatbelts on because he thought it was like discrimination against people with big families. There are 10 kids in my family, right? Now you can't imagine getting in a car without it, but we create these boogeymen. Who could interfere with the Ford Motor Company and tell them how to do their cars? So I think the government has to kind of re-engage its role in terms of the public trust and not just be another client.
I'm so happy you brought this up because we wrote a paper called Data Sheets for Data Sets with actually Kate Crawford and a whole bunch of other people. And one of the things we did was we had case studies, and the automobile industry was one of the case studies, and we were saying it took many years for them to legislate that you have to have seatbelts, and even when they were doing crash tests, they did them with dummies with prototypical male bodies, so then you ended up having car accidents that disproportionately killed women and children, and so we were drawing a parallel and trying to make some case studies, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Right, and it's, it's not the car, but it's, there are certain uses that are very dangerous for society, and, there has to be some interventions there. I think that one of, I always think of civil rights and civil liberties as either protected by friction or by law. Mm-hmm. I think, decades ago, it wasn't possible to monitor who people were using face surveillance, but now the technology has advanced, and the friction, much of that friction in terms of what the police can do, what the government can do, has been eviscerated. And so then the question is sort of what types of protections are going to be built back up to protect the public and communities. So, we at the ACLU have called on Congress to pass a federal moratorium on face surveillance to give us the time to really think through the implications. Obviously, we have also been in this large coalition pushing on Amazon and other companies to stop providing it to the government because of sort of some of the threats and the dangers that we've talked about. As I mentioned, over 450 Amazon employees have themselves spoken out in writing to Jeff Bezos about this. And today an Amazon employee actually called Jeff Bezos out in an op-ed. Yesterday when he was on a panel, Jeff Bezos actually acknowledged that there's this tech could be used by autocrats, but suggests that the company really has no responsibility, that instead we should leave it to society's eventual immune response to address the threats in terms of the real threats to community members. In contrast, Google has new AI principles that specifically say they will not pursue technologies that gather or use information for surveillance, violating international norms or principles of human rights. So with our last sort of couple minutes, for both of you to answer one or both, what do you think some of the responsibility of companies is? What should they be doing, and what should lawmakers be doing?
Well, I'll talk specifically about companies, and then you can talk about lawmakers maybe. But I think what happened at Google is an example of the fact that corporations consist of people, and people have values, and people can agitate, and people can change the course of things. And so I think people in corporations need to remember the fact that they have these values, and that it's their responsibility to agitate for change. So I'll just keep it there.
I think the government has the long view. And they hold, in many ways, the responsibility of communicating history to corporations and other companies that are developing technologies and setting up the guardrails. So, if we think about platforms like the internet, for example, these are public spaces that have been created. They're virtual, but they've been created. We know what has happened in the physical public space historically in this country. We know that most of our civil rights movement was a fight over dignity in the public space. That's a lesson, right, to communicate as you think through how you're going to engage that new technology. And the same is true for facial recognition technology. If we think about racial profiling, for example, and so forth, it's the government's obligation to recognize that those kinds of pitfalls exist and to compel corporations to adhere to some kind of regulatory scheme that guards against what we know are the excesses of every system. We're doing the same things over and over again. There's certain themes that are recurring in American public life. Racial discrimination is one of them. So the idea that we're going to create some new technology and we don't have to worry about racial discrimination is absurd. And so the government has to take responsibility for that.
I think that that's a really good segue into our audience question. So the audience question is it already too late? Aren't we already on camera everywhere we go? And I think, Timnit's thought, that companies are formed of people, and we are all people.
I don't know everything that's going on.
Yeah.
So I'm learning new things. Like I said, every day I learn a new thing about, Joy had talked to me about a company that's, interviewing people on camera, doing emotion recognition on them, and then giving verbal and nonverbal cues to the employers who are their customers. I didn't know this existed until she wrote an op-ed about it, right? So every day I'm learning something new, and I feel like we're just unleashing this technology everywhere without guardrails, without regulation, without some sort of standard. I don't think it's too late because people wear seatbelts now, right? So I think it's become standard. So I don't think it's too late, but we have to move fast.
Yeah, and tens of thousands of people were killed in cars
before
there were seatbelts, and it wasn't too late when we finally got seatbelts. You just do what you have to do at the time that you can. But I do think we have to jump ahead of it, because what's dangerous about all of this is how deeply embedded it can become. That's part of why we don't know, because it's so easy to slip in and to embed in a variety of contexts, in the employment context, in the law enforcement context, and then it's hard to get it out. So that's why I do think there's a sense of urgency that we have to move very, very quickly.
I agree. And I mean, sort of just what I've seen in the past 6 months is the ACLU has been working in this coalition to really blow the whistle on these issues and bring a lot of national attention. The fact that there has been such a great response and that people have been moving with haste to sort of really start to address these issues. I think Kate and Meredith talking about sort of all that's happened in this past year, where so many people are sort of waking up to these issues. Of course, I work at the ACLU, so I never think it's too late. But there's a long arc of history, and I think that we as people can really work together to influence that history and to make sure that civil rights and civil liberties are protected. Historically, there's always been an advance in technology, and it takes some time for those protections to get in place, but we should not just leave it to an immune response. We have to actually push that response and make sure it happens both in companies and by lawmakers.
It makes me think about tasers, in part because the taser company is the same company doing a lot of the facial recognition technology in law enforcement. But when tasers first came out, remember, this was supposed to stop the use of lethal force by police officers. This was greeted as something that was going to be great because now police officers wouldn't have to kill you, right? So it didn't get to any of the the discrimination or use of excessive force or brutality or any of that. It was just that, you might not die. That was the theory. And even that's wrong, right? We just, the Supreme Court just denied a case we had in which our client was tased to death. But let's leave, as terrible as that is, let's leave that to the side. It really is about the dignity issues. It really is about all of the issues that surround law enforcement that we recognize and talk about. And just switching the technology to something actually doesn't get at the problem. So I think that in that sense, it is not too late, because we keep kind of referring to this again and again and again, and we're really nibbling around what is the core issue, which is we've got problems that we have to solve, very deep problems, and layering new and faster technologies on top of those problems, ultimately doesn't get us there.
Oh, I wanna say that seeing the level of discourse about this year versus last year, it's a pretty big difference. And even, Meg Mitchell, who's somewhere here, I think, and I are trying to co-organize a fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics workshop at a computer vision technical conference, and now people are starting to be excited by this kind of topic, right? 3 years ago, if I mentioned this, even when I started partnering with Joy, I was trying to explain to them why this research was important, and it was very difficult for me to explain to people what I was doing. So I think there's a glimmer of hope there.
No, I think there absolutely is, and action and involvement by everyone in this audience, and hopefully everyone who's watching us, does make a huge difference. Our ability to sort of change the narrative, change the trajectory in the companies and by lawmakers really is based on sort of how many people speak up and work together on these issues. So I am optimistic. I think that we can really do some important work here, and the last 6 months have just reinforced that. So I want to thank our panelists so much for joining us tonight, and I want to thank you all for coming. And now it's time for our first spotlight of the evening. So thank you very much.